but I'm going to talk about a topic that I'd picked for today anyway, which is the relevance of cold water timing. Probably won't take super long. A lot of people are using cold water plunges for a lot of different reasons. Some of them good, some of them bad. Definitely some of the limitations and dependencies as far as context are definitely being understood more clearly. Because in the past, people have kind of just done them because it felt good, because of the sense of well-being you get afterward, and because it can help with certain aches and pains maybe associated with training, and even people that don't really train much, just in general. There are European countries where it's actually common practice, just because it feels good. And some people do that as a hobby here as well, that no association with training at all. So what's going on? So cold water plunges, and so I should define terms here. When I describe a cold water plunge, I'm talking about water that's generally going to be below 40 degrees. And although 50 degrees even can be fine, and usually for, um, a minute even would be a minimum. Up to some people are doing it for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, I've heard of. I don't think there's probably a whole lot of benefit in going past 10 minutes that I'm personally aware of or that I've read about. And in the bodybuilding world, as soon as a couple studies came out that brought out that it blunts hypertrophy, which is the accrual of muscle mass, it's sort of like practically condemned, which it didn't really need to be necessarily. So, and those studies were valid. And what they did was they would have people do cold plunge therapy immediately following training sessions. And it did seem to blunt hypertrophy because of what cold water plunges do. So let's talk about what they do. The big two things that they do is reduce inflammation and increase dopamine, increase conversion to dopamine, actually. So that's can be good, of course, but it's not always good, because when you're building muscle, I forget how many growth pathways there are. It's like 15 or something along those lines. There are many muscle growth pathways and factors and sort of signaling responses. There's mechanical tension, there's inflammatory responses, there's even the fact that there's the muscles become fuller and you get that pump. That appears to be a signaling device. All these things, right? All of them, if you look, pretty much all of them result in or are directly some form of inflammation. A muscle pump is inflammation. It's fluid going to a tissue when it's, I don't want to say in distress, but kind of like being used, and undergoing stress. So when you do a cold water plunge, you're basically all those inflammatory cascades that have begun from the workout that might be aiding in not necessarily recovery. Certainly recovery is part of it, but actual growth beyond homeostasis, it appears to interrupt that. But that is, as far as I'm aware, only in the context immediately following. Now, how long do you have to wait? I don't know. I don't think anybody really knows, but I would suspect it's many hours later. But because of, now this is in the bodybuilding context, right? For muscle accrual. I'm not talking about strength. I'll get to that. So I just want to preface that. In general, for health reasons, I would still prefer a person to do their cold plunges in the morning, preferably pretty much upon waking. And why is this? So this has a lot to do with aiding in circadian signaling. One of the things that happens when you're exposed to cold, and this is part of why I recommend people go outside, whatever, you get the sunlight when you first wake up. And if it's cloudy, then you still get the solar radiation, that kind of thing. Even if it's no sun, there's stars and there's a moon, there's solar radiation present outside that you're not getting that's inside. That's useful. In the winter, when there's less of that and you get cold, it produces similar signaling. It's sort of a compensating control. And this is particularly true of people of European or any northern latitude descent. We actually, our mitochondria are more sensitized to the usefulness of the cold, or we're accustomed to it and sort of dependent on it in the winter, just like any organism is, but we in particular are. But we're also particularly sensitive to the positive effects of sunlight that cold exposure is. I don't want to say replacing, but accomplishing accomplishing a similar result as far as it pertains to the biological signaling in the human body. Now, those who are of have ancestry that's closer to the equator, those persons are going to be more sensitized to the cold for its signaling purposes and less sensitized to sunlight, partly as a result of just being darker skinned. Being darker skinned means you block sunlight. So actually, the more equatorial your genetics, especially as it pertains to the mitochondrial genetics, the more you're going to actually need that sunlight signaling. So to give you an example, I talked to a coach a while ago that I did a consult with. He has worked with a lot of people and done a lot of study on mitochondrial genetics, which, by the way, are passed down through the mother. The rest of your genetics are passed down. It's sort of 50-50, mother and father, that kind of thing. As far as mitochondrial genetics, they're only passed down through the mother. The father actually has no effect. So you would actually look to the genetics of your mother to know, and you can get this tested. There's a couple sites. If you just do like a normal genetic testing site, you won't do it unless you buy that package, but there's going to be like a -M for mitochondria test or something along those lines. That you can have added to the genetic test that will kind of tell you like where your genetics are from. And maybe it'll tell you a few other things about yourself. But anyway, he observed that during the wintertime, when people are using red light therapy and things like that to sort of try to get the health benefits of sunlight without having sunlight, what's like a minimum threshold to be generally healthy, right? He has found that it seems like people with light skin, half an hour is often enough, as long as you have sufficient wattage. If you're looking at 30 plus watts, you're standing close enough to it, and you're getting a lot of skin exposure. He said that in a lot of cases, half an hour is all it takes. But he also said that someone that is of darker skin color, just because what the pigmentation in the skin is doing is it's converting that radiation, that energy, into heat. So all the light gets, not all the light, but more of the light gets converted to heat, the darker it is. That's why like a black t-shirt like I'm wearing now on a sunny day is not very comfortable if it's a warm day, because it's converting light to heat. It absorbs it and gets hot. That's what the skin of someone that has this, if someone has dark skin, that's what it's doing. So they might need an hour plus of exposure at the same wattage to get the same result. Now I kind of went down a rabbit trail, so I'll go back to cold exposure. Similarly, it seems like potentially people of equatorial descent might be able to get away with actually less cold exposure to get a similar signal. The morning cold signaling, whether you go outside and expose yourself to cold or jump in water, seems to be very protective of the circadian rhythm and can be very useful from that point of view, especially if you're someone that is indoors a lot and you don't get that daylight for much of the day. You don't get direct sunlight at noon, that sort of thing, where you get the good balance of UV and red light and infrared. So it has that use, but one of the big uses is dopamine conversion. When you start your day, cortisol elevates as you go from sleeping to wakefulness. You're going to have an elevation of cortisol. That's a good thing. That's part of just getting some of the processes in the body started. You don't want it to be elevated a ton, obviously, but it does go up. You also don't want that to remain elevated for long, because you want to get back into a parasympathetic state where you're generally quite restful, and you're going to perform better as a human if you're not in a high stress state. And it from what I gather, it seems like women are particularly sensitive to that in particular. Men can kind of like wake up and go off into a stressful environment and still thrive okay. Women seem to be very sensitive to that because they're more sensitive to the balance of serotonin to dopamine ratios than men are. It still matters with men, but it seems to particularly matter with women and their sense of well-being and certain other functions in the body. So a way to counteract that is to get that cold water exposure. I actually have now, we know that I haven't done the blood work because we can't yet, but I have a client that she is in a high stress environment at home just because there's a lot of factors and things going on that are fairly out of her control. One way that we've tried to compensate for that was to go outside in the cold. She has some morning chores. So in the winter, she lives in a northern latitude in the United States. So my advice was instead of wearing a jacket, just wear your t-shirt. And so where she lives, that's still pretty uncomfortable. She did that. She said it seemed to help with morning wakefulness and things like that, but it wasn't like much of a game changer. So what we later switched to was she's still doing that. She actually does cold water therapy with red light in the morning. And she's only in the cold water for a minute or two while doing breath exercises, because this also will help lower cortisol. This has had the effect. The first week that she did it, she dropped 7 pounds, 6 or 7 pounds. I forget which. 6 or 7 pounds in 1 week, practically a pound a day in water weight, probably just because of cortisol levels coming down, dopamine getting up where it should be. She didn't lose that much fat. In fact, I've done her diet. She's in a very, very slight caloric deficit, but it's not much of a deficit. So this had a very profound impact, probably on her cortisol levels. I didn't do the blood work. We haven't been able to. We don't know for sure, but it does make sense. And it corroborates what other coaches' experience has been and that sort of thing. So that morning time seems to be protective of the overall sense of well-being and the balance of serotonin to dopamine in the human. Now, what other reasons could you use it? Well, if you're doing pure hypertrophy work and you're trying to gain muscle, morning's probably fine. But I would generally try to avoid using it after training, unless it's like you're training in the morning and you use it in the evening. It can be useful to help you go to bed too, because you're going to get that relaxing state, that more parasympathetic state. The dopamine kicks in, serotonin comes down, and the other thing too is that may help reduce core temperature slightly, which to go to sleep, your core temperature has to drop by a degree or so, often a little less than that, I believe, but we'll just say about a degree. So that cooling off can be helpful. They're actually European countries. I can't remember which one it is. It's Sweden or something. Their practice is while they get ready for bed, they actually open the windows in the bedroom in the winter and let the room get cold while they're brushing their teeth or changing their clothes or whatever. Let the room get cold, close the windows, climb in bed, kind of be cold for a while till you warm up under the blankets, but the room environment is still pretty chilly. And this is to help their temperature, their core temperature go down. So it can be useful for that. The other use that it can have for people that are pursuing athletics is just reduction of soreness in the muscles and in the joints. Will this blunt your recovery as far as like muscle recovery? I don't think so, at least because it's not been my experience. But it seems to blunt hypertrophy responses. Again, probably the further removed it is from hypertrophy stimulus, the less that's probably true. I have personally used it during times when I'm doing strength training. I don't do it during hypertrophy phases when I'm trying to gain muscle, but right now I'm doing strength training. And so on my rougher lower body days, I will typically do cold followed by heat. So I'll fill my bathtub up and it's not that cold. It's like 50 degrees, maybe high 40s. I'll just be in there for like a minute, and only my lower body, actually gets any effect, but that's the part I care about. So I'm not getting the full all the way up to the neck dopamine signaling response, but I'm getting the inflammation reduction. I can feel that. I'll do about a minute, and then I'll get it about as hot as I can stand, and then I'll sit in that for about 10 minutes. And that promotes blood flow and things like that. Now we've reduced the inflammation. Now I'm promoting blood flow and that kind of thing. And it is also relaxing. And there's a pragmatic effect where the thing that relaxes you should have the potential to help you to recover. Even like certain things that might be suboptimal may be useful. For example, I know of athletes that they drink a beer the night before a competition, like right before bed. Is that optimal for sleep quality and a bunch of other things in health? No, but if it helps them fall asleep faster, they get an extra hour of sleep, it's probably on the whole worth it. So it can have I would say a strong use there as it pertains to helping promote a parasympathetic state, but also like helping just with some of those joint pains and things like that. Remember, during a strength phase, you typically don't really care about accruing muscle. You're trying to express the strength potential that you've built up via accruing muscle mass, and now let's build skills to use the muscle mass in a particular context or endeavor. So what we're looking for in that context is, how can I recover from the strength training as quickly as possible? And that might be via reduction of inflammation so that I can train again. And the sooner I can train again, the better off I'll be, the stronger I should be able to become, or something along those lines. And of course, if it helps sleep, all the better. But for those that might be wondering what's optimal, I would generally say do your cold plunge first thing in the morning as early as you possibly can. If you can get out of bed and hop in cold water, it's probably the best time in general. Now, it can get more nuanced from there as far as what's best for you. There can be other times that might make more sense, but that's what I would generally recommend people do because it seems to help with circadian rhythms and you will feel good. Um, it's like a way to um, inoculate yourself against some of the stresses of the day. It does seem to help make the day go better, probably because of the dopamine signaling. And I think there's also just a psychological aspect of, you started the day in discomfort, you're probably not going to endure that much discomfort the rest of the day. So the worst part's over. And so it kind of like, it's like anchoring. It's like sets you at a level that you can sort of compare the rest to, in your day subconsciously. And by comparison, everything's fine because, like, hey, at least I'm not in cold water because it's not comfortable. Even people that do it a lot will tell you like it's not, because they usually don't love it while they're in it a ton, although some people do. But for most people, it's still a little bit of a discipline thing in the morning. But it can be a very good and useful habit.